Hello and welcome back to the London History Podcast. I am Hazel Baker, qualified London tour guide, founder of londonguidedwalks.co.uk, and your companion through the hidden layers of this extraordinary city. Today, I want to take you somewhere that isn't on most tourist maps, and yet it's everywhere. Threaded through the Victorian streets such as West Hampstead or Belgravia, sunk below the pavements, hidden behind archways built into the very walls of the grandest but also middle-class houses in London. I want to take you below stairs. We are going on a walk, an auditory tour, if you will, through the physical remains of Victorian servant London. The coal hole covers, the sunken area steps, the cobbled mews, the bell systems, and the houses where an invisible army of workers kept the whole elegant machine running. And here's the thing, most of this is still there. You just have to know where to look. By the end of this episode, you'll never walk through Kensington, Chelsea, or many areas with Victorian or Georgian houses in quite the same way again. And you'll find yourself looking down at the pavement instead of up at the fanlight windows. You'll peer through iron railings at sunken steps and wonder who last walked down them with a coal scuttle in each hand. You'll turn a corner into a cobbled mews alley and hear, just faintly, the ghost of iron horseshoes on stone. Shall we begin? I want to start by asking you to picture Victorian London, the classic version, the one from every period drama you've ever watched. Grand stucco terraces in Mayfair, glossy painted front doors in high gloss black or deep green, white facades that almost look like wedding cakes. Sweeping stone steps, a horse-drawn carriage pulling up, a gentleman in a top hat stepping down. Everything is elegant. Everything looks effortless. Everything appears almost aggressively clean. That image is a front, a performance. And today we're going to slip around the back door because those elegant townhouses, those grand facades on Belgrave Square or Eaton Square or Grosvenor Square were not self-maintaining. They were powered by a vast, hidden flesh and blood machine. And the scale of that machine is almost impossible to overstate. By 1871, over 1.3 million domestic servants were recorded in the census of England and Wales. By 1881, if you look at indoor female servants alone, that number had climbed to almost 1.6 million women. That's roughly a third of all working women aged 10 and over. Think about that, a third of all working women in domestic service. Domestic service wasn't a niche job. It was the single largest employer of women in 19th century Britain, larger in total than all of manufacturing combined. In the supposed age of the Industrial Revolution, the steam engines, the looms, the great cotton mills of the north, the biggest industry in the country was keeping middle and upper class households clean, fed and warm. Now, if you want a vivid sense of what that poverty and class disparity looked like on the ground, do go back and listen to episode 143, Oliver Twist's London. That's where we follow Dickens into the workhouses, slums and markets that shaped one of literature's most famous orphans. The servant world and the poverty world were often separated by a very thin line, and London, as usual, was at the heart of it all. The city had a particular problem that made the demand for servants almost insatiable, and that problem was soot. Every household was burning coal. Every factory, every railway engine, every business in this city was burning coal around the clock. The result was a thick, greasy, sulphurous layer of black soot that settled on every flat surface in London, indoors and out, within minutes. If you listen to episode 107, Rats, a Victorian Problem, you'll remember how I set the scene of Victorian London streets. The noise, the smells, the sheer physical hostility of the urban environment. The soot was part of that same world. There's a wonderful detail in Victorian advice manuals for servants. They actually instructed maids not to lay the dining room table too early before a meal. Because if you put out the crisp white tablecloth and set the silver, a visible layer of black dust will settle on the plates before the family has even sat down. Maintaining the illusion of pristine, effortless elegance in a city that was effectively one giant chimney required a literal army of people, constantly scrubbing, sweeping, polishing and wiping. You finish the drawing room, step out into the hall, and by the time you're downstairs, the soot has already started to settle on the mantelpiece again. It was, as someone once wrote, like shoveling snow in a blizzard. The work was never done. Now, why were so many of those workers women? Partly social convention, yes, but also brilliantly the tax code. If a Victorian household wanted to employ a male servant, a footman in livery for instance, they had to pay a government licence fee. The Treasury had classified male servants in the same taxable category as owning a luxury carriage or a coat of arms. They were, legally speaking, a status symbol, a luxury good. Female labour, by contrast, attracted no such tax. Women were considered perfectly adequate for cooking, cleaning and running the house. So the economics pushed families towards female staff, and a huge pool of young women migrating from the countryside into the city needed exactly this kind of work. The result was so deeply embedded in the culture that it changed the physical architecture of the city. Victorian property developers, even on modest semi-detached villas in Islington or Clapham, built houses with bell wire already threaded through the walls during construction. Just as we'd expect a new build today to have internet cabling, Victorian builders laid copper wire for the servant bell system as a matter of course. They assumed that whoever moved in would eventually have domestic staff to summon. Hold that thought as we step outside. Because everything we've just discussed, the hierarchy, the invisibility, the infrastructure, is written into the streets of Mayfair and Belgravia, and a lot of it is still there. Before we start walking, it's worth understanding the world that existed beneath those ground houses. Downstairs was not a free-for-all. It was a fiercely rigid hierarchy, a parallel social structure as formalised as anything upstairs. At the very top, the butler and the housekeeper. These were the two senior figures operating as joint heads of a small company. The butler ran the male staff, the footman, the hallboy, the wine cellar, the silver. The housekeeper ran the female staff, the housemaids, the laundry, the linen room, the household stores. Their domains were strictly non-overlapping, and they guarded the boundaries with professional jealousy. Below them, the cook, who ran the kitchen with what every account seems to describe as fierce dictatorial authority. The lady's maid and the valet, personal attendants to the mistress and master, and these were relatively privileged positions. They had access to the family's private rooms, and in the case of a lady's maid, might travel with her employer and wear her cast-off clothes. Then you drop down to the lower servants, the ones doing the genuinely heavy work. Housemaids were up before dawn, lighting fires, carrying hot water, sweeping carpets, beating rugs. They earned perhaps £10 to £25 a year. Footmen were the public face, the ones in livery who opened the doors, waited at tables and accompanied the family in the carriage. But remember, employing them came with that government tax. Kitchen maids worked under the cook in a constant cycle of chopping, peeling and washing up. And at the absolute bottom of the domestic pyramid, the scullery maid. She was often the youngest person in the servant household, 14, 15, maybe 16 years old. She woke earliest and went to bed the latest. She cleaned out the grates before lighting the kitchen range, emptied chamber pots, scrubbed floors and pots with lye soap so caustic it cracked her hands. She earned between £6 and £15 a year, and she slept under the roof, in an unheated attic, often sharing a cold room with the other girls. Out in the mews behind the house, there was a separate little world. The coachman, grooms and stable boys who kept the horses and carriages running. Their day started at dawn, with grooming, currycomb and brush, horse by horse, before the family ever thought about getting up, let alone going out. Now, all of these people, from the butler with his keys to the wine cellar to the teenager with her bucket of cold water, were bound by one overarching rule. The Victorians called it, in effect, invisibility. Servants were to use back stairs and servants' entrances. They were never to set foot on the main staircase unless cleaning it. Mrs. Beeton's book of household management, the closest thing Victorian Britain had to an operations manual for the domestic world, made it explicit. A servant was not to be seated in an employer's presence, not to offer an opinion unless asked, not to say good morning or good night unless spoken to first. And if a servant somehow found themselves on a main corridor and a family member appeared, well, they were expected to turn immediately and face the wall. Not bow, not curtsy, not speak. Simply become, in that moment, part of the wallpaper. Beeton's instructions weren't a fringe view, they were mainstream, and the most extraordinary expression of this doctrine of invisibility was the stripping of names. It was considered too much effort, generally too much trouble for a household to learn the real names of the working class people who lived inside their home. So they recycled names by position. Whoever the first lady's maid was, she was called Rose, maybe. Whoever held the position of first footman maybe answered to Thomas or John. It didn't matter what name their parents had given them. You took the job and you took the name that came with it. I always find that this is the most chilling detail in all of this because it tells you something essential about the psychology at work. The ultimate luxury for a Victorian upper-class family wasn't just having someone else to do their housework. It was the illusion that the housework happened by magic. If you acknowledge a servant by their real name, if you make eye contact while she's carrying a heavy water jug up the stairs, you shatter that fantasy. You're reminded that your elegant life is sustained by tired, soot-covered women living in your freezing attic. So they looked away. They renamed. They made their own city invisible to themselves. And then, and this is the part I find endlessly fascinating, they built that invisibility into the architecture of the streets. This is exactly the kind of hidden social machinery that Robert Louis Stevenson was writing about in his Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which we cover in episode 115. Stevenson set his story in London precisely because the city already had this architecture of concealment built into it. The respectable front and the darker world just out of sight. Let's head to Belgravia. Imagine we're standing on a street like Eaton Square or Chester Square, a broad, elegant Victorian terrace of stuccoed front houses. Most visitors look up. The grand front door elevated from the pavement, a sweep of stone steps leading to it, a beautiful fanlight, the architecture projecting seamlessness and privilege. I want you to look down. Running along the pavement, parallel to the street, is a set of wrought iron railings, and if you look over them, you see a narrow flight of steps, dropping away from street level into a sunken, shadowed space. And this is what architects call the area. And it's the most important thing to understand about how a Victorian townhouse actually worked. The area was the servants' entrance and the tradesmen's entrance. It ran along to the front of the basement, giving direct access to the kitchen and scullery without anyone having to pass through the elegant front hall. Deliveries arrived here. Coal, food, laundry, anything requiring a working-class person to enter the building. The family and their guests swept up the stone steps to the front door. Everyone else went down. At night, the iron area gate was locked from the inside. Security? Yes, but also a very literal expression of separation. The servants were fenced off from the respectable street above them. One building, two very different worlds, engineered so precisely that neither world need ever catch a glimpse of the other. These area steps are still everywhere in Belgravia, Mayfair, West Hampstead, wherever. And in some streets, every single house still has them. Stone steps worn smooth by a century and a half of use. Iron railings dark with old paint. Eaton Square, Chester Square, Belgrave Square. All of it is still there. And if you know the TV series Upstairs, Downstairs, you'll be interested to know that the fictional address, 165 Eaton Place, was actually filmed at 65 Eaton Place, a real Belgravia address. The area steps are right where they always were. Now we're going to walk north through Mayfair towards North Audley Street. And this time I want you to look at the pavement, not the buildings. Set into the flagstones outside almost every Georgian and Victorian house in this part of London are small, circular cast iron covers, about 30 centimetres across, flat, often with decorative patterns moulded into the iron or the name of a foundry. Most people walking past assume they're utility access covers, gas, water, electricity. They're not. Every one of these discs is the mouth of a coal chute. The coal delivery man would pull up with the horse-drawn cart, prise open the cover and tip a £100 sack of coal directly down into the brick vault below the pavement. His job then ended. He drove away. But the coal didn't magically appear in the fireplaces upstairs. That was where the human machine took over. A servant, almost always a woman, would go into that vault, shovel the coal into heavy iron scuttles, carry those scuttles through the cellar, up the narrow back stairs, flight after flight after flight, and distribute the fuel to the kitchen range and every fireplace in a 5-storey townhouse. Several times a day. A full coal scuttle could weigh 30 or 40 pounds, and she had to carry it without dirtying the walls or without dropping a piece of coal on the carpet and without disturbing the family going about their comfortable day above. Think about that the next time you pass one of those covers. London still has these coal holes and streets all over the West End and beyond. Mayfair, Belgravia, Bloomsbury, Greenwich, they're everywhere once you start looking. On North Audley Street, the local council actually commissioned a series of artistic replacement covers in 2013, specifically designed to reference local Victorian history. It's the city acknowledging, in its own way, I suppose, the ghosts of the infrastructure under your feet. Before we trot on into the Mews, I want to pause on one piece of the invisible infrastructure, the servant bell system. From the mid-18th century onwards, grander houses began installing mechanical bell pull systems. By the Victorian era, it was standard in any house with pretensions to respectability, and as we discussed, even modest suburban semis were being built with the infrastructure pre-installed. Here's how it worked. Builders threaded thin copper tubes through the walls and under the floors of the house, snaking from the main family rooms all the way down to the kitchen and scullery. Inside those copper tubes were thin tension wires. Each wire was connected at one end to an ornate bell in the family room. In the kitchen, There'd be a whole row of these bells, each one mounted on its own coiled spring and labelled with the name of the room: library, morning room, dining room, master bedroom. When the master tugged the cord in his study, the wire pulled taut through the copper tube, travelled down through the walls, and the corresponding spring-mounted bell in the kitchen would jingle and ring. But here's my favourite detail. Experienced servants didn't need to look at the labels. Every bell had a slightly different length of wire connecting it to the pull upstairs, and the bells themselves varied subtly in size and weight. The result was that each bell produced a slightly different tone, a different pitch and ring. A scullery maid with her hands in a pot could hear a bell and know instantly without looking up. That's the slow, deep bell ring of the library bell. That's the quick, sharp jingle from the morning room. They had acoustically matched the entire house inside their heads. By the Edwardian period, electric indicator boards replaced the mechanical bells. Silent, discreet boxes with small glass windows where a coloured disc would drop into view when a button was pressed upstairs. Even the technology evolved to become more invisible, more seamless, less intrusive on the calm of the house. This is the same period, the late Victorian and Edwardian era, where we see enormous investment in underground infrastructures across the city. And if you're curious about how the Victorians approached ambitious engineering as a solution to urban problems, I'll direct you back to episode 137, The Thames Tunnel, where we explore how Mark and Isabel Kingdom Brunel built the world's underwater tunnel and the extraordinary human cost of doing so. The ambition to build things beneath the surface of London runs right through this period. Bell wires under the plaster, coal vaults under the pavement, tunnels under the river. Below is where everything happened. Traces of bell systems survive in many Victorian properties today, sometimes behind skirting boards, sometimes still mounted in basement boards. If you ever visit a historic house, look on the kitchen walls for the mounting brackets and spring hooks. Now let's step through an archway into a different world entirely. Behind the grand frontages of Mayfair, Belgravia, Marylebone and Kensington, tucked into service alleys that run parallel to the main streets, are the Mews. And walking into one of those is the most evocative things you can do in London if you know what you're actually looking at. The word Mews goes back to royal falconry. A mews was originally where hawks were kept while molting, but by the Victorian era it meant something very specific. A row of stables and carriage houses with living quarters above, arranged around a cobbled yard or alley behind a great house. The layout was almost universal. Ground floor, stables for the carriage horses, and bays to store the carriages themselves. First floor, the hayloft, storing the enormous quantities of fodder the horses required. And right at the top, under the roof slates, in the most cramped and uncomfortable quarters in the building, the rooms of the coachman, the grooms, and the stable boys. Living above working stables was, by every contemporary account, deeply unpleasant. The noise of iron horseshoes on cobblestones at all hours, the overwhelming smell of ammonia and manure, swarms of flies in summer penetrating damp in winter. The grandest houses sometimes ran suburban tunnels connecting the mews directly to the main house's basement, so staff and supplies could move without appearing in the street at all. By the late Victorian period, mews housing was considered some of the most undesirable in London. Poor, cramped, noisy, smelly. Think of the conditions in episode 134, Organ Grinders of Little Italy, where we explored the cramped courts and alleys of Clerkenwell's immigrant community, the hardship behind the music. The Mews was a similar world, a working-class enclave embedded invisibly inside the wealthiest postcodes in the city. And then, starting in the 1960s, something extraordinary happened. Londoners rediscovered them. The cobbles became charming rather than hardscrabble. The old stable doors became features rather than faults. The cramped rooms got knocked through and opened up with glass. Today, a Mews house in Belgravia or Kensington is almost the most expensive address in the city. Up until 1939, there were around 200 working mews in central London, still full of horses and the people who cared for them. Almost all have since been converted, but I want to take you to 3 that still tell their story. If you want to see Victorian mews at their most intact and extensive, come to Hyde Park Gardens Mews, just north of Hyde Park in W2. Architectural historian Bridget Cherry described it as one of the most extensive surviving set of service buildings for Grand London houses anywhere in the city. It was built between 1836 and 1840, an entire cobbled street with 46 Grade 2 listed properties approached through archways at each end. Stand at the entrance under the archway and look down the street. The proportions are unmistakably equine. The wide ground floor openings that once held stable doors, the low first floor hayloft windows, the narrow upper story rooms where the grooms slept. The whole street still feels like a service corridor behind something much grander. Now, mentally remove the parked cars, add the smell of hay and horse sweat, add the sound of iron shoes clattering on the cobbles, add exhausted men in leather aprons scrubbing down horses at the end of a 14-hour day. It completely changes what you're looking at. Back in Belgravia, Belgravia Mews West runs behind the vast houses of Belgrave Square, and tucked into it is the Star Pub, which opened in 1848. The records describe it as being built specifically to serve the workmen and servants of the nobility in the surrounding mews. Think about what that means. The grand houses on Belgrave Square had their private dining rooms, their drawing rooms, their well-stocked wine cellars. Just around the corner, in a cobbled alley, the people who kept those houses running had their pub. One brief hour of relief if they could get permission to leave the house. Nearby is Groom Place, and the name itself is the clue. When you see a Mews street named after a working profession rather than a nearby aristocratic estate, you're looking at a geographical fossil. This street was named for the men who worked in it. The grooms are long gone, but their name is still on the street. And then there's Bathurst Mews near Lancaster Gate. This is the one that will generally stop you in your tracks if you visit at the right times. Bathurst Mews still has working stables. Hyde Park Stables operates here. Horses are stabled, cared for and ridden out into the park every day. If you time it right, you can stand on those original uneven cobblestones and hear the sound of hooves. Real hooves on cobblestones in the heart of London. Out of 200 working mews that existed in central London just before the Second World War, this is one of the last. It's the nearest thing to a time machine for the soundscape of Victorian servant London that this city still has to offer. Now, let's walk back through Mayfair now towards Piccadilly and slip into a tiny network of courtyards and alleys between the grand boulevards. Shepherd Market still sits between Piccadilly and Curzon Street. It was built in the 1730s and 1740s on the site of the original May Fair, which is incidentally where the whole neighbourhood gets its name. And it is, even today, a remarkable thing. A cramped, intimate, almost village-like cluster of small shops, old pubs and narrow lanes dropped right into the heart of one of the most expensive postcodes in the world. Historically, this was the supply chain for the grand houses nearby. The butcher, the baker, the grocer, the chandler, the working trades that kept Mayfair functioning. The elegant families who lived on Grosvenor Square and Street Hill probably never even set foot in Shepherd Market. But their cooks and housekeepers came here every day, collecting orders, settling bills, and I strongly suspect catching up on every scrap of gossip in the neighbourhood. If you stand in the main courtyard today and turn around in a slow circle, the contrast is striking. Above the roofline, you can see just a glimpse of the backs of the grand townhouses and office blocks. At street level, you're in a different world. Narrow passageways, modest frontages, hand-painted signs, the sort of scale that makes you instinctively drop your voice. This is Mayfair, not as a stage set for aristocratic display, but as a working village. In episode 157, From Factory Floor to Black Market, the button theft scandal, we explored the Victorian East End economy of stolen goods where servants and working-class Londoners moved in an entirely parallel commercial world to the wealthy households nearby. Shepherd Market is the legal, legitimate version of that same parallel economy. An entire commercial district whose reason for existence was to supply and sustain the servant world. You can imagine the rhythm of it on a weekday morning in, let's say, 1880s. A procession of uniformed footmen and plain-dressed housemaids weaving through the alleys with baskets on their arms, kitchen boys running errands, cooks inspecting carcasses at the butcher's, housekeepers arguing over the price of tea or sugar. The money belonged to the families on the squares, but the relationships, the trust, the grudges, the quiet favours were forged down here between traders and servants. Places like Shepherd Market also functioned as an information exchange. In a world before telephones in private houses were common, news travelled along servant networks. A new cook taken on in Park Lane, a footman dismissed in Curzon Street, a housekeeper looking for a reliable laundry. All of that information moved through spaces like this. If you wanted to know what was really happening in Mayfair, you didn't ask in the drawing room. You listened in the shop doorway. There's a social geography lesson hidden here. Mayfair, when you understand its layout, stops being simply a collection of grand houses. It becomes a dual economy. The silent, stucco-fronted stage at the front, and the noisy, essential working village around the corner that kept the lights on. The family's world and the servants' world touched physically, separated by just a few yards of brick and cobblestones, but they experienced Mayfair as entirely different places. Walk through Shepherd Market today and it still feels distinct from its surroundings. The scale is different. Human scale, the scale of daily commerce rather than aristocratic performance. It's exactly what you'd expect from a place that existed to serve, not impress. And once you've seen it that way, every narrow service passage you find in Mayfair or Belgravia suddenly clicks into focus. You are standing in the infrastructure of the servant city. I want to walk you through a single day. Not the family's day. Their routine is very well documented. I want to follow the servants. It's 5 o'clock in the morning. In the attic bedroom, just under the roof, a girl of 15 or 16 wakes up under a thin blanket. Ooh, the room is unheated. In winter, the water in her washing pitcher might be frozen solid. She dresses quickly in the dark. She can't afford to burn candles unnecessarily, and begins her descent through the sleeping house to the basement. Her first task? The kitchen range. She clears out yesterday's ash with heavy iron tools, relays the fire with coal she has to carry from the cellar, and sets the copper pans to boil. Then she goes back upstairs to collect the chamber pots from the family bedrooms and scrubs them clean. She does all of this before most of London is awake. By 6:30, the housemaids are moving through the upper rooms, opening shutters, hauling thick rugs outside to be beaten, laying fires in the grates of the morning room, the drawing room, the study, the family bedrooms, and carrying heavy ceramic jugs of hot water up the stairs so the family can wash their faces when they eventually choose to rise. All of this, every fire lit, every floor swept, every surface dusted, must be finished and invisible before the family comes downstairs for breakfast. If they catch a maid in a family room still working, something had failed. The whole point is that the house appears to have been maintained by invisible hands. At 7:30, the cook arrives in the kitchen. The scullery maid, who has already been up working for 2.5 hours, stands up straight and greets her with a curtsy. At 8:15, the lower servants gather briefly in the servants' hall for breakfast, seated strictly by rank, at distance from each other, laid out by household etiquette. This is probably the only time in the day that they all sit down together. Then the day continues. Housemaids sweeping, dusting, turning mattresses, polishing brass and copper. Kitchen maid and scullery maid, and a perpetual cycle of preparation and washing up. The butler checking the silver, decanting the wine, reviewing the evening's requirements. The footmen polishing livery buttons. In the evening, the butler and footmen are on show in the dining room, standing for hours, serving, pouring, presenting the household at its most immaculate. And when the family finally retire to bed, the scullery maid is still in the basement, scrubbing the last of the dinner pots by the light of a candle. She might not reach her cold attic room until 10 or 11 at night, and she'll be up again at 5 a.m. That is a 17-hour day. Perhaps one afternoon off per week. No private space to speak of. No right to leave the building without permission. And earning for all of this somewhere between £6 and £15 a year. Let me put that in the sharpest possible context. At the same moment in history, the Duke of Westminster, whose family owned the freehold under most of Mayfair and Belgravia, had an income in the tens of thousands of pounds and employed approximately 100 servants between his various households. The girl scrubbing his pots at midnight was earning £6 a year. He was earning more in a week than she would earn in a decade. Before we talk about why servants stayed in service, I want to take a brief detour through popular culture. Because if you're interested enough in Victorian servant life to be listening to this episode, then there's a very good chance your mental image of it has been shaped, or at least partly shaped, by Downton Abbey or Upstairs, Downstairs. And I say this with real affection because I enjoy a well-made period drama as much as anyone, but I think we owe it to the real people whose lives these stories draw on to be honest about what those shows get right and what they significantly and sometimes dangerously soften. Upstairs, Downstairs ran on ITV from 1971, and its original creators, actress Jean Marsh and Eileen Atkins, were quite open that they had conceived it partly as history from below. They wanted to show the servants' perspective, the freezing attic bedrooms, the boiling kitchens. Noble intentions, but as historian Lucy Dalup has pointed out, while class disparity features in both shows, the actual physical labour of servants is almost entirely absent. Hannah Culwick, a Victorian general servant who kept a detailed diary, described her knees as being like a nutmeg grater from years of scrubbing floors on stone. You don't see that in the Downton kitchen. You see gleaming copper pans and a cheerful Mrs. Patmore. The chapped hands, the cracked skin from lye soap, the sheer bodily toil, that's invisible. Which is ironically exactly how the Victorians wanted it. What's more, when historians have interviewed women who actually worked in domestic service in the early 20th century, they found something striking. Employers might describe their bond with a long-serving maid as warm friendship. But, as Lucy Lethbridge found when researching servants, a downstairs view, servants themselves rarely use that word, and in many cases are in fact uncomfortable with it. The warm relationship between Lady Mary and her maid Anna, or the paternal Lord Grantham lending books to his chauffeur, these met the expectations of a modern audience. They were not representative of the historical experience. Gordon Jackson, who played the butler Hudson in Upstairs, Downstairs, was refreshingly honest about this. He called it one of the best roles he had ever had, but also said that if he'd actually had to do it in real life, he'd rather have begged on the streets. The shows also, with a few notable exceptions, sidestep entirely the most uncomfortable element of Victorian servant life, and that is where we need to go next. I wanted to talk about something that is historically very well documented, but rarely discussed in comfortable primetime drama. I'm going to address it directly and carefully, because leaving it out of this picture does a disservice to the women who lived it. Female domestic servants were among the most sexually vulnerable people in Victorian Britain. To understand why, you only need to think about the structural reality for a moment. A young woman, often 14, 15, 16 years old, leaves a family in the countryside and moves into a stranger's house in the city. She has no truly private space. She's on the premises at all hours. Her employer has absolute authority over her livelihood. There is no employment contract, no trade union, no meaningful legal protection, and a single thing standing between her and destitution is a written character reference from the very person who might be the source of the problem. The reference system was, in effect, a mechanism of silence. Academic research, including Cambridge University's work on the sexual harassment of female servants, establishes that there existed a widespread cultural assumption that masters held informal sexual access to their female servants. Samuel Richardson's 1740 best-selling novel Pamela, about a servant who repeatedly fends off her employer's assaults, was a blockbuster precisely because readers recognised the situation. That cultural assumption, as historians note, casts its shadow across the following century and beyond. The perpetrators were not only the men of the house. Research by historian Anna Clark found that around 31% of recorded sexual assaults on servants were carried out by fellow male servants. Footmen, coachmen, stable hands, who had physical access to the same living spaces. The private home was a workplace with no witnesses, and in most cases, no accountability. For a servant who became pregnant as a result, whether through rape, coercion, or a relationship in which the power imbalance made anything like genuine consent impossible, no new position. Without a position, no income, no roof. The most likely outcomes from that point were the workhouse, prostitution, or attempting a desperate and dangerous illegal abortion. Dr. Pamela Cox, a social historian who presented the BBC series Servants, The True Story of Life Below Stairs, has said plainly, fallen women homes were full of former servants who had to leave their employment because they had been victims of sexual assault, victims of sexual abuse in some way. Courts offered almost no protection. A servant's word against an employer's was almost never believed. Being alone in a room with a man could be, and was, interpreted as evidence of consent, and if a woman spoke publicly, she would almost certainly lose her reference, her reputation, and her livelihood, while the man faced little or no consequence. I'm conscious that Downton Abbey did eventually include a rape storyline, the maid Anna Bates, assaulted by a visiting valet in Series 4, and it triggered a genuine public conversation. But historians at King's College London have noted the dilemma that period dramas face here. Depicting sexual violence to set the historical tone without proper systematic context risks it feeling like isolated dramatic incident rather than structural reality. One shocking scene in an otherwise cosily romantic world is not the same as telling the truth. The truth is that this was not an exceptional event. It was a risk embedded in the entire institution of domestic service, built into every power dynamic we've been discussing today. This is the history. It lived in silence, in the parish registers listing illegitimate children with no father's name recorded, in the women quietly dismissed from households with no explanation and no reference, in the workhouses and the fallen women homes and the terrifying arithmetic of a girl with no choices left. The women who lived through this and said nothing, not because nothing happened, but because to speak was to lose everything they had, deserve to be part of this story too. The obvious question at this point is why? Why would anyone sign up for this? And the answer, when you look at the alternatives, is stark. The Victorian factory floor was unregulated, physically dangerous, and could kill you. Cotton mills meant lung disease and the risk of losing a limb to the machinery. Casual street labour meant day-to-day hunger. No shelter if you were sick, no safety net of any kind. I spoke at some length about Victorian street poverty in episode 107, Rats, a Victorian Problem, but the contrast between the servant world and the very poorest Londoners is worth stating plainly. Domestic service, for all its hardships, offered a guaranteed roof, guaranteed meals, a degree of physical safety from the streets, and it was considered by the standards of the time respectable. That word mattered enormously in a society as rigidly stratified as Victorian Britain. The servant was legally and socially above the casual labourer and the match girl. It was a survival strategy, not a comfortable one, not a dignified one by our standards, but rational in the context of what the alternatives actually look like. Which is exactly why the theft scandal in episode 157 makes such human sense. When those women stole buttons from the Hackney factory floor, they were navigating a world in which one wrong step, one lost position, a bad reference, an accusation of impropriety could send you sliding from the relative security of service to the absolute insecurity of the streets. The margins were that thin. So far, we've been outside. Now, let's step inside. If you want to see the full vertical structure of a Victorian London household in 3 dimensions, the single best place to do this in London is to go to 18 Stafford Terrace in Kensington, often called Sanborn House. From 1875, the house was home to Edward Linley Sanborn, a cartoonist for Punch magazine, and his wife Marion, their 2 children, and their live-in servants. The interiors were decorated in the house beautiful aesthetic style, layers of dense patterned wallpaper, William Morris designs, pictures hung frame to frame on almost every wall. And crucially, the house was left almost untouched by subsequent generations. It is today one of the most intact Victorian middle-class London townhouses anywhere in the city. It's managed by the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea and open to visitors from Wednesday to Sunday. So put that on your list. But here's why it matters for today's episode. When you walk in through the front door, you step into the family's world, and it's overwhelmingly, almost claustrophobically rich. Thick carpet, dense wallpaper, heavy curtains, every surface covered. This is the aesthetic of comfort, insulation, and display. The world as the family wanted it to look. But when you take the back stairs down to the basement, the wallpaper stops instantly. The floors are stone with drains built in. The walls are plain plaster, and you see the kitchen range, a massive, imposing piece of iron engineering that required constant feeding. The scullery, where all the wet, dirty work was done, the narrow service stairs that servants ran up and down all day, carrying loads that would make us wince today. And you can see, if you look carefully, the remains of the bell system, the mounting brackets and spring hoods still on the kitchen walls where the bellboard once hung. Architectural scars of the invisible infrastructure we've been talking about in this episode. Walking that transition from drawing room to scullery in 30 seconds makes the reality of Victorian domestic life undeniably concrete. Let me bring everything we've looked at today into one frame. Stand anywhere in Belgravia or Mayfair and look at what is actually in front of you. On one level, the grand squares, the stucco terraces, the private gardens, the gleaming front doors. The city as it presented itself to the world. Elegant, effortless, impeccably maintained. Just inches away, built into the same fabric of the same street, the area railings with the worn stone steps dropping into the shadows. The coal hole covers set into the pavement, the cobbled Mews alley, running behind the terrace with the old stable door proportions still visible in what's now a converted house. The street name on a corner, Groom Place, that tells you exactly who used to live here. In episode 115, we talked about how Stevenson used London's architecture of concealment as the structural metaphor for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the respectable front door and the hidden back alley door of the same building, leading to 2 utterly different worlds, under the same roof. He didn't need to invent that. He just looked at the city around him. Victorian London was, deliberately and precisely, a dual city. A London above stairs and a London below stairs, occupying the same geography, entirely dependent on each other, but designed from the foundations up to prevent their inhabitants from ever truly meeting as equals. The family's world was elevated, light-filled, ornamented, designed to impress. The servants' world was sunken, plain, reached through back doors and down narrow stairs, designed to be invisible. And here's the haunting truth. It worked! It worked so well that most people walking through Mayfair and Belgravia today don't notice half of what is still there. The coal holes, the area steps, the Mews, the bell wire still coiled inside the plasterwork. The city is still standing. You just have to learn how to see it. So next time you're in this part of London, I want you to try something. Don't look at the front doors, look at the iron railings and the steps dropping down into the area. Look at the round iron covers in the pavement. Slip through an archway into a mews and let the cobbles slow you down. Ask yourself, which door would I have used? Which back stair, which bell would I have been waiting to hear? Because understanding the servant world, the scale of it, the detail of it, the sheer human cost of it, completely rewrites how you read this city. If you enjoyed this episode, there's a whole cluster of related episodes that build on today's theme. For the poverty and class context, episode 143, Oliver Twist's London, and episode 107, Rats, a Victorian Problem. For the stolen goods economy hiding behind Victorian respectability, episode 157, The Button Theft Scandal. For the Victorian immigrant working class tucked invisibly into the city's wealthiest areas, then episode 134, Organ Grinders of Little Italy, will tick that box for you. And for the engineering ambition that was reshaping London Underground at exactly the same period, episode 137, The Thames Tunnel, will do that for you. They all fit together. Victorian London was a city of layers, and the more layers you peel back, the more you find. And if you'd like to walk London, then join us for a guided walk at londonguidedwalks.co.uk. We also do private tours around Clerkenwell, for example, round Belgravia, Pimlico, so you can see a lot of these areas yourself. And of course, all bookable online at londonguidedwalks.co.uk. And if you enjoyed this episode, please do leave us a review, share it with fellow history enthusiasts, and come back for the next one. There's always another layer to find. Until then.